You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 528 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, at the end of the last episode, we said that we'd been asked to speak on one of those American Cruise Line's historical tours, a riverboat cruise up the Tennessee River from Shiloh to Chattanooga, and, well, we're back.
It was our first cruise of any kind and our first time participating in a tour like that, so it was a completely new experience for us. We have to say the American Cruise Line's staff on the ship, the American Symphony, was fantastic. We're talking top-notch customer service.
Yep, and the folks who had us drop into the middle of their Civil War tour package were lovely. They were very gracious and patient with us with everything that went on while we were with them. And for us, it was definitely, a working vacation. And I have to admit, we were ridiculously glad to get home. And so, full disclosure, with just getting home from that trip and with this being a holiday weekend with Memorial Day, we were looking for the path of least resistance as far as getting a new episode out to everyone. And we thought, hey, why not just use one of the presentations we gave on the cruise?
So this is a talk that Rich gave on the cruise about Joe Wheeler. And it was neat because the next day, when the ship was docked in Florence, Alabama, the Civil War group took a short bus ride to visit Wheeler's home at Pond Spring.
All of that is a long way to say that this week you guys are getting an episode on the life of Joe Wheeler. And we'll get back to the Atlanta campaign with the next show.
To say that Joseph Wheeler led a remarkable life is a bit of an understatement. He was a Confederate cavalry general during the Civil War and later was a U.S. Army general during the Spanish-American War, and he also served multiple terms in Congress. So, as you can tell from just that one sentence, Wheeler's life offers a unique lens into Civil War, reconciliation, and national reunification.
Joseph Wheeler III, the youngest son of Joseph Wheeler Jr. and Julia Knox Hall Wheeler, was born in Augusta, Georgia on September 10, 1836. Our Joseph inherited the junior suffix when his dad dropped it upon the death of his own father. Later in life, our Joseph would drop the junior, and when he would have a son, he'd be named Joseph Wheeler Jr., so interestingly, they ended up having 3 generations of Joseph Wheeler Jr.'s.
In any case, our Joseph is reported to have been much like his father, with one biographer noting that, quote, the physical characteristics of the two were much the same slight build and mildness of countenance. In temperament, they showed similar traits, especially shrewdness and caution. 2, there was in both father and son an aloofness and reserve which few men ever really penetrated.
With regard to that aloofness and reserve, another biographer notes that both father and son did indeed sometimes adopt an exaggerated sense of dignity and formality that some people found off-putting, but others credited that poise and air of seriousness with helping further the career of the father as a businessman and the career of the son as a professional soldier.
Both Joseph's father and mother had family connections to New England, to Connecticut and Massachusetts. And after the death of Joseph's mother in 1842, his father moved the family from Georgia to Connecticut, and that's where our Joseph attended school. His fellow students are reported to have regarded him as, quote, stiff, polite, and very serious.
Upon graduation, he left Connecticut for New York City, where he lived first with a sister, then with an aunt, while working as a clerk in a business office. He did that for over a year, until in 1854 he was notified of his acceptance into West Point. Apparently, since an early age, dreams of martial glory had danced in young Joseph's head, nurtured by tales of a grandfather who had served as a general during the Revolutionary War and a great-uncle who had served as an officer in the War of 1812 and died a hero in a battle with the British.
At West Point, Cadet Wheeler didn't exactly distinguish himself academically, nor did he distinguish himself as an athlete or excel at tactics. However, socially, despite being an introvert and his serious demeanor, he acquired a handful of close friends and was well thought of by his fellow cadets, one of whom recalled him as, quote, always earnest and quiet.
His abysmal academic record was reflected in his final class standing, which was 19th out of 22 cadets in the class of 1859. Ironically, though, of those 22, Wheeler would be the only one to achieve military fame, although two other members of the class would also serve as general officers on the Union side during the Civil War. Well, Wheeler's low class standing guaranteed that upon graduation, he wouldn't receive an appointment with the engineers or artillery, who got the cream of the crop, so it would either be the infantry or the mounted service for him. And by all accounts, Wheeler, who loved horses since a young age and had developed into an accomplished equestrian despite his poor grades in cavalry tactics, was pleased to find himself assigned to the 1st United States Dragoons.
Second Lieutenant Joseph Wheeler started his service with that regiment not in the field but at a training facility, specifically the Cavalry School at Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania. Not much is known about Wheeler's time at Carlisle, which ended in the late spring of 1860. He then went to Washington, D.C. to seek a transfer to the Regiment of Mounted Rifles.
Apparently, during his time at Carlisle, Wheeler decided he preferred the organization and the tactics of the Mounted Rifles. In contrast to the Dragoons, who fought mounted half the time, and the cavalry, who fought mostly from the saddle, the officers and men of the Mounted Rifles fought almost entirely on foot. At any rate, in June 1860, Wheeler learned of his posting to the Regiment of Mounted Rifles, and he set out to join his new unit in the New Mexico Territory, with his ultimate destination being Fort Craig on the Rio Grande in south-central New Mexico. He spent the next months at Fort Craig, as well as other outposts in the territory, taking part in operations designed to protect settlers and travelers from marauding Apaches.
However, according to a highly dramatic account penned by Wheeler himself, he commenced his Indian fighting before ever reaching Fort Craig.
Right. You see, on the journey west, he was detailed to guard a wagon containing a surgeon and a pregnant woman who was the wife of an officer at the fort. When the woman went into labor, forcing the wagon to halt, the rest of the column rather ungallantly continued on. And sure enough, no sooner had the woman given birth than an Apache war party attacked the wagon. Well, according to Wheeler, quote, the air seemed filled with arrows, end quote. But he and the wagon driver and the surgeon opened fire and managed to drive off the Indians. After catching up to the rest of the wagon train, the other travelers, upon hearing the story, awarded the young lieutenant the nickname Fighting Joe, which would stick to him for the rest of his life.
It seems that after his action-packed introduction to life on the Indian frontier, the balance of Fighting Joe's service in New Mexico was rather anticlimactic. Then, as the presidential election of 1860 drew near and the simmering sectional crisis threatened to boil over, not even Fort Craig in the far-off New Mexico territory was immune to the tension.
Although the majority of the enlisted personnel were Northern or foreign-born, most of the officers in Wheeler's regiment were Southerners, who made it known that if Lincoln won the White House and the sectional crisis boiled over into secession and war, then they would resign their commissions and head back east to defend hearth and home from the very government they'd served since joining the Army. Because his regional allegiance didn't appear so clear-cut, one might assume Joe Wheeler would have had a more difficult time determining which way he'd jump when it came to secession and war. After all, although he'd been born in the Deep South, his family's roots, and much of his own upbringing, were tied to the North. But Wheeler never seemed to be in doubt about the path he'd take. After Lincoln's electoral victory in November 1860 and the secession of South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama, a secession convention was convened in Georgia, and there seemed little question the state would leave the Union. Wheeler wrote to his brother William in Georgia that, quote, "Much as I love the Union and much as I am attached to my profession, all would be given up when my state, by its action, shows that such a course is necessary and proper."
Well, Georgia adopted its ordinance of secession on January 19th, and on February 27th, 1861, Joseph Wheeler resigned his commission in the U.S. Army.
By early April 1861, 1 week before the bombardment of Fort Sumter, his brother in Georgia had secured him an appointment as a lieutenant of artillery in the Confederate Army. By late April, Wheeler was in Georgia, where he received orders to report to the headquarters of Braxton Bragg's Department of Alabama and West Florida at Pensacola, Florida. There, Bragg put Wheeler in charge of repairing and remounting the heavy cannon that U.S. forces had spiked and or dismounted when they'd evacuated several coastal fortifications. And in the course of completing that task, Wheeler sufficiently impressed some Alabamans during their stint of duty at Pensacola that when a number of them returned home and formed the core of a new regiment being organized, the 19th Alabama, they requested that then Lieutenant Wheeler be promoted to colonel and be given command of the 19th.
And their request was approved. Wheeler was catapulted from artillery lieutenant to infantry colonel in September 1861. And that fall, just as Lieutenant Wheeler's competence and self-confidence had impressed Braxton Bragg, Colonel Wheeler's rigorous training program that turned the 19th Alabama into a well-drilled regiment also favorably impressed Bragg.
Then, in the spring of 1862, when the Confederacy carried out a large concentration of troops in northern Mississippi in an attempt to halt Ulysses S. Grant's string of victories that took him to Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River, Wheeler was put in charge of a newly organized brigade for a short time, even though he was still a young and untried colonel, before he returned to command of his regiment before the Battle of Shiloh.
While commanding the 19th Alabama at Shiloh, Wheeler acquitted himself well. His conduct during the 2 days of the battle, making multiple attacks on April 6th and holding his ground against heavy odds for much of the 7th, and his command of the rear guard during the retreat to Corinth earned him praise from his superiors, including Braxton Bragg.
However, Wheeler seems to have decided that his performance was deserving of even greater recognition, and so he exaggerated his role in the fight and claimed honors not strictly his due. Since this was an unfortunate habit that Wheeler would practice throughout his wartime career, It's worth noting the words of one of his biographers on the subject. Quote, Wheeler would never be content to allow the facts to speak for themselves. If he was driven by a compulsion to exaggerate and fancify in order to strengthen his claims to success, he was by no means alone. For every Civil War commander, in recounting his participation in battle, resorted at some point to self-serving fiction. But Wheeler could always be counted on to exceed the norm. He would embellish the record whenever reality failed to produce the impression of himself that he wished to convey.
Expedia and Visit Scotland invite you to come step into centuries of history that await in Scotland. Castles steeped in legend walk along cobblestone streets. Come share the warmth of stories passed down through generations. This is a place with a past that is fully present today and all yours to explore. Plan your Scottish escape today at expedia.com/Visit Scotland.
You may think you know McDonald's drinks, but you don't know them like this. From fruity refreshers like the Strawberry Watermelon Refresher and the Mango Pineapple Refresher with popping boba, to crafted sodas like the Sprite Berry Blast with berry-flavored Sprite topped with cold foam. Who knew ice-cold drinks could be so fire? 6 all-new drinks are here. Try them all, now at McDonald's. Refreshers contain caffeine.
This spring, Uber Eats has you covered. Whether you're celebrating mom, dad, or your favorite grad, not all of us are great planners, and with the Uber Eats gift hub, you don't have to be. Send flowers, perfume, champagne, or just their favorite meal straight to their door. Gifts arrive in as little as 25 minutes, and you can add a personalized video message for that additional so-not-last-minute touch. So this spring, get a leg up on gift giving with Uber Eats. Last-minute gifts that land every time. Must be 21 or older to purchase alcohol. Product availability varies per region. See app for details.
After Shiloh and after Beauregard was removed from Army Command, Braxton Bragg was elevated to command the Army of the Mississippi, and in July 1862, Bragg gave Wheeler command of one of the Army's cavalry brigades.
There was a certain logic behind the assignment, for although Wheeler had been commanding infantry for the better part of a year, his pre-war training and experience had been in the mounted service. Well, during Braxton Bragg's and Kirby Smith's invasion of Kentucky that summer, Wheeler's brigade of horsemen was one of 2 initially under Bragg's command. The 2nd Brigade was led by Nathan Bedford Forrest. This was the first time Wheeler and Forrest operated together, and in the months and years to come, the 2 men would forge an uneasy working relationship. You see, Braxton Bragg viewed Forrest and his men as good fighters but poor soldiers, effective at scouting and raiding, but not suited to handle the work cavalry was expected to perform in close support of the main army. Wheeler, on the other hand, earned Braxton Bragg's confidence by smartly carrying out that work, and he thus made himself indispensable to Bragg. Now, as you guys know, Braxton Bragg was a polarizing figure, to put it mildly, and during the balance of 1862 and through 1863, when the high command of the Confederates' main army in the West, the Army of Tennessee, was poisoned by toxicity as it divided itself into bitterly opposed pro-Bragg and anti-Bragg camps, well, not surprisingly, given Bragg's role in the advancement of his career so far during the war, Joe Wheeler was a Bragg man.
In the late fall of 1862, after Bragg retreated from Kentucky, he named Wheeler Chief of Cavalry for the Army, and Wheeler was promoted to Brigadier General, with the appointment dating from October 30th.
During the run-up to the midwinter battle at Stones River, or Murfreesboro, which took place as the calendar rolled over from 1862 to 63, Wheeler's primary task was to use his horsemen to delay the Federals until Bragg could form the Army of Tennessee to receive them, a difficult task that Wheeler performed successfully. Then, during the battle, Wheeler undertook a raid into the enemy's rear, a ride that took the 2,000 Confederate cavalrymen completely around the Union Army, a la Jeb Stuart.
Soon after, another raid north to the Cumberland River led to Wheeler not only receiving the formal thanks of the Confederate Congress, but on January 22, 1863, a promotion, which at just 26 years old made Joe Wheeler the youngest major general in Confederate service.
Interestingly, Wheeler's elevation to that rank wouldn't be formally approved by the Confederate Senate for an entire year, not until January 1864, by which time the general who had recommended him for it, Bragg, was out as commander of the Army of Tennessee, having been replaced by Joseph E. Johnston. Bragg resigned after retreating from Chattanooga following the Confederate debacle at Missionary Ridge on November 25, 1863. And Wheeler's cavalry covered Bragg's retreat from Chattanooga into northern Georgia, and Wheeler received a wound in his foot on November 27th when his horsemen and Patrick Cleburne's Confederate infantry stopped the Federal pursuit at the Battle of Ringgold Gap.
Throughout the late spring and summer of 1864, during William Tecumseh Sherman's Atlanta campaign, Wheeler's cavalry screened the flanks of the Army of Tennessee as Johnston withdrew from several positions toward Atlanta.
In July, when Sherman sent 2 large columns of Union horsemen to destroy the railroads supplying the defenders of Atlanta, Wheeler defeated the enemy raids, in the process capturing Major General George Stoneman, who would be the highest-ranking Federal prisoner of the war. In August, Wheeler took his horsemen and crossed the Chattahoochee River in an attempt to destroy the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which was Sherman's supply line back to Chattanooga. Wheeler captured the town of Dalton, a critical point on the railroad, but failed to defeat the enemy garrison in a nearby fort. Foiled in that regard, Wheeler then took his horsemen up into East Tennessee, crossing the Tennessee River above Knoxville.
His raid then continued to the west, causing minor interruptions to service along the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, and then continued south through Franklin, Tennessee, until he recrossed the Tennessee River at Tuscumbia, Alabama.
It sounds like an impressive achievement, but Wheeler's raid was described by historian Ed Bars as a quote-unquote Confederate disaster because it caused minimal damage or disruption to Federal logistics, while it denied John Bell Hood, now in command of the Army of Tennessee, the direct support of his cavalry during a critical period in the campaign for Atlanta. Without accurate intelligence of Sherman's dispositions, Hood, on the last day of August and the first day of September 1864, lost the Battle of Jonesboro and was forced to evacuate Atlanta. Wheeler and his horsemen, who had been utterly worn out after their raid, wouldn't rejoin the army until early October.
In late 1864, Wheeler's cavalry didn't accompany Hood on his disastrous foray up into Tennessee, and as a result, Wheeler's horsemen were virtually the only effective Confederate force in Georgia to offer any opposition during Sherman's famous March to the Sea.
However, what resistance Wheeler's cavalry did offer Sherman was little comfort to Georgians, since the notoriously lax discipline of Wheeler's command resulted in an enormous amount of resentment among civilians as the rebel cavalrymen looted homes and farms to such an extent that Confederate Major General D.H. Hill noted that, quote, "the whole of Georgia is full of bitter complaints of Wheeler's cavalry."
Wheeler and his horsemen continued to dog Sherman's operations during the 1865 Carolinas campaign. Wheeler's last notable success came when he defeated a force of Union cavalry led by Judson Kilpatrick at the Battle of Aiken, South Carolina, on February 11th.
After he came under Lieutenant General Wade Hampton's command, Wheeler fought under Hampton at the Battle of Bentonville, North Carolina, on March 19th, 20th. A month later, Wheeler refused to abide by the terms of Joe Johnston's April 26 surrender to Sherman at Durham Station, North Carolina, and he set out with a handful of aides and troopers in an attempt to catch up to Jefferson Davis as the Confederate president fled south. However, on May 9th, before he could link up with Davis's party, Wheeler was captured by Union cavalry near Conyers, Georgia, about 25 miles east of Atlanta. Wheeler was imprisoned for 2 months, first at Fortress Monroe at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula, and then at Fort Delaware, where he was paroled on June 8, 1865.
After the war, Joe Wheeler became a planter and a lawyer near Courtland in northern Alabama. He married a rich young widow and raised a family. His home, Pond Spring, is a historical site owned and operated by the Alabama Historical Commission.
In 1880, Wheeler was elected from Alabama as a Democrat to the U.S. House of Representatives and went to Washington. However, his opponent, a fellow named William Lowe, contested the results of the election, and after a contentious legal battle that lasted over a year, Lowe was declared the winner and assumed the seat on June 3, 1882. However, Lowe served only 4 months before dying of tuberculosis. Wheeler entered and won the ensuing special election and returned to Washington to serve what was by then the remaining weeks of the term.
After all that, Wheeler didn't run for re-election in 1882, but was elected again in 1884 and to 7 subsequent terms before resigning in 1900.
One of his legislative priorities while serving in Congress was working to better the navigation along the Tennessee River in northern Alabama to help his constituents, many of whom were planters and small farmers who depended upon the river to get their crops to market. He was also known as a proponent of national reconciliation between the North and the South after the Civil War.
In 1898, Wheeler, now age 61, volunteered for service in the Spanish-American War, receiving an appointment as Major General of Volunteers from President William McKinley, who was a former Civil War veteran himself and thought giving commissions to a few old Confederate generals would further the cause of national reconciliation.
Wheeler assumed command of the cavalry division accompanying the Army's expedition to Cuba, which included 2 regiments of black cavalrymen and Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. And one of Wheeler's aides was his son, Lieutenant Joe Wheeler, Jr., who had graduated a few years earlier from West Point.
Upon disembarking, Wheeler was charged with scouting for the U.S. advance by 5th Corps Commander General William Shafter. Shafter ordered Wheeler not to engage the Spaniards until all the American troops had disembarked.
However, when his forces approached Las Guasimas de Sevilla on June 24th, and Cuban scouts told Wheeler the Spaniards were preparing to abandon their position, he ordered an immediate attack. As it turned out, the fighting at Las Guasimas was the first major engagement of the war, because the Spaniards weren't quite ready to pull out after all.
Wheeler's forces moved to encircle the Spaniards' line, assaulting from front and flank, but were repelled. During a pause in the fighting, both sides fed in reinforcements. Then, after midday, the American attack was renewed, but again stalled.
The U.S. forces were only able to push forward after the Spaniards did withdraw, according to plan, towards Santiago's outer defenses. While the fighting had cost the Americans 17 dead and 52 wounded, the engagement is best remembered for the story that during the excitement of battle, Wheeler so forgot himself that he called out, "Let's go, boys! We've got the damn Yankees on the run!"
Wheeler fell seriously ill during the campaign and turned over command of the cavalry division to Brigadier General Samuel Sumner. Wheeler's daughter Annie was with him in Cuba and acted as his nurse, but Wheeler was still sick in July when the Battle of San Juan Hill began.
It's said that once he heard the sound of the guns, he returned to the front lines despite his illness, then led the cavalry division through the siege of Santiago and was a senior member of the Peace Commission. Then, after returning to the United States and commanding the Army's convalescent camp at Montauk Point, New York, Wheeler sailed for the Philippines. You see, after its defeat in the Spanish-American War, Spain ceded its colony in the Philippines to the U.S. But after it became clear the Americans wouldn't be granting them independence, the Filipinos revolted. The Philippine Revolt, or Philippine-American War, lasted from February 1899 to July 1902.
Joe Wheeler, along with his son once again, and also Annie, arrived in the Philippines in August 1899. He commanded the 1st Brigade in Arthur MacArthur's 2nd Division until January 1900.
During his service in the Philippines, Wheeler was mustered out of the volunteer service and commissioned a brigadier general in the regular army, thus re-entering the organization from which he'd resigned in 1861.
After returning home from the Philippines, Wheeler resigned his seat in Congress and commanded the Army's Military Department of the Lakes, so named because it took in the Great Lakes region, until his retirement from the Army in September 1900, after which he moved to New York City.
While attending the 100th anniversary of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1902, Wheeler walked up to the old West Point Hotel, where his former Confederate comrades, James Longstreet and Porter Alexander, were seated on the porch. During the visit to West Point, Wheeler wore the dress uniform of a general in the U.S. Army, and when Longstreet saw him coming up to the porch of the hotel, he called out, "Joe, I hope the Almighty takes me before he does you, for I want to be there to hear Jubal Early cuss you in that blue uniform." Well, as it turned out, Old Pete did predecease Wheeler, dying in January 1904, while Joe Wheeler, after a prolonged illness, died in Brooklyn on January 25, 1906, at the age of 69. He is one of the few former Confederate officers buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is A Soldier to the Last, Major General Joseph Wheeler in Blue and Gray, by Edward G. Longacre.
You can find a list of all our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website is info about how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and help support the podcast in that way.
Just like Ken S., Pete H., Anthony L., and Merle have all done recently.
A big thank you to each of them and to Tom I. for his donation.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.